Welcome to another edition of the EcoPunks podcast. And today we're going to continue our series on aging, which I would like to just point out as an aside is one of those facts of life, like death, that we all have to deal with right from the very beginning. I'm really happy today to have David returning, who you may recall from the first episode in this series. But I am equally pleased to be joined by Sharita. And I'm going to just talk a bit about these two folks before we launch right in, because I think it proves an interesting point about aging. David has worked for more than 40 years as a psychologist, and very conveniently for this podcast, dealt quite deeply with the issue of aging. So a lot of professional experience in that area. But of course, David is more than just his professional career and has done things from building a log house in the woods with his own bare hands to driving race cars and taking up hockey later in life. Sharita has an interestingly varied professional career. I always love people who have more than one thing on their plate. She spent 25 years in occupational therapy, also did work with geriatric populations in the course of that work, so has some very focused expertise in that area, but then went back to school and got a PhD in community development, which raises all sorts of interesting questions about learning and whether learning should be tied to a particular age or we should be thinking about it more broadly. Sharita then went on to have a very fruitful career as a researcher, as a scholar, as a teacher, an author, and working mostly with issues of trust in groups. But as is typical of so many academics, has not really ever officially retired. Keeps saying that she might, but I'm not sure we're all the way there yet. So with that said, what I really would like to just draw from that is I think the biographies of these two very interesting guests I have today say so much about the connection between lifespan and funds of knowledge. We can talk about experts, but I want to put that aside for a second and think instead about how a cumulative number of years means a greater number of data points, a heck of a lot of experience, and that fund of knowledge is something that I think we ignore at our peril. So that said, I would love to kick off the conversation. And the provocation I would like to start with today as we talk about the question of what actually happens to the way we think as we get older, is to just break open the notion of what professionals in psychology or philosophy like to call cognition. But I think for our purposes today, let's call it the mind. And try looking at the mind as something that is bigger than our brain, that it extends beyond our rational, conscious thinking selves to include a whole bunch of different kinds of mental activity, whether it's muscle memory, gut feelings. Those are all sort of bodily manifestations of the mind. The way our mind can extend to the tools we're using, the way our mind is created in relationship by our interactions with other beings. So with that lengthy prologue, I deliberately wanted to have both male and female guests today because one of the first things that came to my mind when I was thinking about this topic is, how does gender difference play into this, if at all? And the reason that came to mind was I thought, well, if we think about minds purely as brains, it shouldn't really matter too much. But if we think about mind as something bigger than that, that our thinking perhaps isn't purely confined to our brains, but our bodies are involved with our thinking, then maybe gender does make a little bit more of a difference. And I would love to know if either of you had a reflection or something to say to that.
Can I jump in for a sec, David?
Please do.
I think the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about gender and mind, I'm going to say that what happens with women going through perimenopause and menopause is that there are in many women subtle changes in memory and subtle changes in terms of attention span. What happens, I think, with women is at first this is kind of disturbing for a woman. And then what happens is people get used to it, so they compensate. I definitely don't know exactly how they compensate. But the brain has a certain amount of neuroplasticity. In other words, we can learn new things even though we get older. And we can learn how to compensate for perhaps some of the sequelae of, our hormones going a little weird when, we enter menopause.
I think that's a really interesting point. As you were describing menopausal changes, of course, I thought, well, of course, the flip side of that is the onset of puberty.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That they're sort of a
So,
pair.
And this is going back to, or perhaps sending it back to David, in that, I too will struggle with the idea of mind because I can divide up a whole bunch of things. I don't think there's one solid definition of mind. I think that as human beings, it's a combination of synapses, neurons, hormones, various chemicals, etc. So, as David has said, basically we're aging from the moment we're born, and we go through phases. And we go through, various stages in terms of, let's say, our memory or thinking or, our emotions play into it. David, are you going to help me out?
Well, I have a specific question for David. Thank you, Sharita, because he prompted it. So, David, as you know, there's a ton of focus on the earlier developmental stages of life. And I think even people more generally are aware of a lot of the work in that area. I feel like there isn't quite the same level of public awareness around work on the latter half of life, on the developmental stages that happen after, let's say, 50. And, do you have a thought about why that is? What is it? Is that something that you experienced in your own professional life?
It's interesting that you put it that way. It makes me think of current events in American politics, strangely enough, because the issue around the age of the candidates for the presidency and how confusing this is for the governments, because there's an entry age into being able to serve as president, but not a terminal age. And the reason why that I've come to understand is that when the Constitution of America was written, lifespan was something like 48 years. And so the Constitution creators never imagined that there would be a time when somebody was in their 70s or 80s and still contending to be um, the president. So there's that um, um, uh, uh, um, generational gain effect, I think, is a concept that has emerged to understand this. So that, so for example, the winner of a master's level, so older people in athletics, running the 100 meters in in uh, in in the first Masters Olympics was faster than the winner of the Olympics in at the turn of the century. So it seems as if it's almost as if you look at it one way, that people can actually run faster now that they're older than they could before. It's a generational gain effect. The same is true for other things like playing chess and playing tennis. Is that older people now can play at a higher level of competitiveness than younger people in decades gone by. At the same time, um, 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 growth and decline both are happening with people as they age, and we are only just now, well, perhaps the last 50 years, which is not that long a period of time, um, beginning to understand what the characteristics of that latter half, third of life is. So, people say that 60 is the new 30 because there's so much growth in the in this generational gain effect that leads people these days at quite advanced ages to do what younger people weren't able to do in not that very long ago.
Well, let's pick up that point. So if being old ain't what it used to be, um, I think this raises some really interesting questions about um, imagining a different version of age. And I want to sort of hone in on the thinking piece for a second, because that was the nominal title of this episode. You referenced in passing this idea that with the change of age, and especially as we move into the second half of life, there is both growth and decline. And I feel like the decline part has kind of everyone's aware of that. That has been spoken about a lot. That's most commonly what's referenced. But I would love to hear from both of you about areas of growth that we can identify, or areas, let's say, even where the status quo might be maintained. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention in my initial bio was that when I asked Sharita earlier about, what she likes to do for fun, what interests her, she said, I love to learn. I'm a learner. That's everything I do. I love cooking. I love traveling. It's learning. And I thought, wow, this is, we don't really think enough about how learning, despite the cliche about lifelong learning, truly is an activity that can and should be pursued through all the life stages. We talk about, and Sharita, as someone with a lot of expertise in adult education, I always thought it interesting that we have to put adult before education to demarcate it, because there's sort of an assumption that, education, that's for kids, that's for young people. Whereas, why? What does learning magically stop when you hit 25? Like, are you kind of done with learning at that point? I don't think so. So I would love to talk about these areas of growth and or even just maintenance in terms of as one goes through the second part of life. And please, either of you chime in on that topic if you have some thoughts.
Well, perhaps we look at it from, a traditional psychological perspective, and let's use the concept of intelligence, for example. What happens to intelligence? So people consider that there are two broad categories, if you will, of intelligence: fluid intelligence, the rate of new learning, the speed of processing, and crystallized intelligence, which is the accumulation of knowledge. And so with fluid intelligence, unless people work really hard at it in older age, much harder than they would have to when they're younger, fluid intelligence declines.
Sort of like the way that power and strength and physical strength decline unless you work like hell to keep it up there.
Exactly. That's a good metaphor for the decline. Whereas crystallized intelligence remains remarkably stable. In fact, sometimes when people have compromised cognitive abilities by virtue of of various diseases that we're all too familiar with, in speaking most broadly, people can be surprised by the things that they actually are able to remember and think about, that they thought that they were, somebody who could remember, someone with an Alzheimer's disease who was able to remember the color of the dress that their wife wore on the day that they first were married. So that crystallized intelligence remains available to them, even though their fluid intelligence that would allow them to access that information becomes more complicated, and it requires assistance. In the same way that memory for recent events, there's a significant decline in what's called episodic memory as people age. So, the most typical way of testing it is with a word list. We can all remember Donald Trump parroting the words that he had to remember in the MOCA, Montreal Test of Cognitive Abilities, a few years ago. So people can't remember what those words are when they have a disordered brain from any one of a variety of sources, but they can recognize, if they're cued, they can recall the words that they were supposed to remember. So if they, you say, well, I want you to remember the word green. And people are asked, okay, now tell me what that word was you were supposed to remember. And they can't remember it. But if you cue them with, well, it's a color, then they can retrieve the word green. So just examples of the distinction between fluid intelligence, which is the process of cueing to recall, and crystallized intelligence, which is kind of the synapse being there in place, but inaccessible as a result of the struggles of some people as they get old. And when I say that, I don't want to imply that people as they get old lose the capacity lose cognitive capacity, because we think about, when I started working in aging, the assumption was that if we lived long enough, we'd all end up with Alzheimer's disease. I mean, back then, 40 or 50 years ago, we didn't call it Alzheimer's disease. We called it senility, and
Right.
People become senile.
Yeah, which just means old.
Which just means old, and yet, as it turns out, take people over the age of 60, 6% of them will have a dementing illness. 6%. So the association of age with senility, which we now call dementia, is a false comparison.
That's an excellent point. I mean, I would argue even if the percentage were much higher, and let's
So
hypothetically.
let's go to, let me interrupt.
Sure.
Because it does get higher.
Okay.
So let's say if you take a cadre of 85-year-olds,
Yeah.
then you'll find that maybe 30% of them will have a cognitive impairment
Right.
arising from any one of a number of sources. But that's still only 35%. I mean, if you're
still below 50,
if you're one of those 35, then it's not only, it's a significant impact.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
but you know, at the same time, the lifespan is increasing. At least it has for the last a few decades.
Yeah.
The lifespan has gradually increased. People are saying that this lifespan increase has now stopped as a result of I think largely as a result of political and socioeconomic circumstances.
Well, that's that's a whole other can of fish. I want to come back though to your point about these. You know, I thought it was so interesting the way you talked about the cueing being the support that can activate, that can sort of supply the whatever is, you know, if there's a mechanism that is maybe not functioning as well in terms of being able to access that information, that something as simple as just cueing a person can help them overcome that. That sounds a lot to me like disability and the use of aids to live with disability. And I wonder if, and Sharita, this is kind of where I want to throw to you, because the minute I thought of that, I thought, oh, well, this is where education is sort of an interesting case. I mean, so much of education is about not just learning content. I mean, I hope we're sort of beyond that at this point, but about learning how to learn, right? About acquiring cognitive tools, about finding ways to learn. And it seems to me that one way of addressing whatever breakdowns you might experience as you age might be a matter of just accessing the kind of supports or tools that you need in order to be able to function at a level closer to what you had before. And that strikes me also as being intrinsically social, which is something I would like to come back to. But please, Sharita, go ahead.
I think in some ways we're talking about a couple of things. The first thing is, and this, what David was saying also triggered in my mind the idea of problem solving. Some people problem solve their whole lives, whether it's because of the situation that they're living in, or whether it's because of the type of work that they do. Some people look at things as a problem to try to get better at, or realize once they kind of look at a problem, they realize, and if they have insight, okay, I have this problem, how can I compensate for it? And one of my favorite stories is that we had a neighbor, a couple of houses down, who really was in cognitive decline. But she had enough of an idea that she was in cognitive decline that every single day she went over in her mind all the questions that her community liaison would ask her. So, what day is it? Who's the prime minister? Draw a clock. Remember these words. So, what she did was she memorized it. And every day she went over it just in case Ethel from the community support came in and asked her those questions. And she did that because she didn't want to go into the old age home. And she figured that if she failed that test, That was it. She was going into the old age home. And she told me about it again and again and again. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when Ethel came, because I can just see Dorothy just performing, like an absolute champ. Yet, and David also knew this person. She was definitely in cognitive decline. So
But still sly like a fox.
sly like a fox, but I don't call it sly. I call it problem solving and insight.
Yeah.
I make lists, and I'm not as cognitively intact as I was 10 years ago. I make lists.
Yeah.
I use aids.
Yeah.
Ask me.
B.F. Skinner.
Yeah.
B.F. Skinner, Sharita, the behavioral psychologist who, invented operant conditioning, and taught at Harvard when he was in his 80s, wrote a little book called Intellectual Self-Management in Old Age. And one of the techniques that he used to compensate for not being able to remember anyone's name is that when he met people, he would tell them his name first, which would, in the socio-political elements of our relationship building, prompt of the other person to tell them their name. So I would say to you, "Oh, my name's David," and that would prompt you to say, "Oh, Sharita here," and he would thereby be able to compensate for a recognized decline in his cognitive capabilities. And it makes me think that I wonder if there is we talk about aging as a declining way or a stabilizing way, or how do we optimize it? But I wonder if one of the perhaps even as of yet an unstudied element is the extent to which people are self-aware of their cognitive abilities across the lifespan, because the sensitivities of people as they get old and the awareness of the sometimes truthful and sometimes misunderstood and misleading thoughts about cognition and aging increases their self-awareness of cognitive abilities relative to younger people. And it reminds me of some early work that was done comparing younger and older people. So, and linking to the kind of the evolutionary element, the personal evolution of, so when you're young, you need to learn different things than when you're old. And so younger people need to learn the names of things. That is a hammer, or this is a pair of eyeglasses, or that's a glass, and you can't put a glass in the microwave, or you can't put a glass in the oven, it'll crack, or you can't put accumulating the bits and pieces that are required in order to function effectively. Whereas older people are less capable of, are often less capable of retaining those new bits of information, but then on the other hand, they don't have to, because they've already learned it. And so what older people are better at is recalling if they were to read text, for example, younger people might recall words that are used, whereas older people will recall patterns and concepts within the text materials that they were exposed to. So older people learn different things when exposed to the same thing as younger people, because of the need because of the demand for learning across the lifespan.
Well,
Does that make sense to you?
That makes perfect sense. And it actually inspired my next question for both of you, because the combination of hearing Sharita talk about this neighbor so desperate to avoid being warehoused with the other olds, right? And we can obviously expand upon what that is, but it is essentially a form of social isolation, right? Because the way in our culture we deal with the old is we typically stick them only with other old people, which I think very likely has a compounding effect on how you think or what you're, maybe even in a setting where you are infantilized, right? Where it's not uncommon in some kind of senior care setting to see people with very distinguished lifetimes behind them sitting around, cutting and pasting like kindergartners. So we know that is kind of the status quo in our society. But David, what you just said made me wonder, is it possible for us to completely rethink what is possible? Like, if young people learn a certain way, have to learn certain tasks, are good at certain kinds of learning, is there a way of thinking that is the domain of the old, that is a special kind of thing that do we need to reframe what what we imagine when we talk about what older people are doing when they think? Can we talk about that in terms of gains, in terms of something positive, something unique, rather than continuously focusing on, oh, well, here's what was lost? Is there something we can identify as being uniquely the gift of age in this area?
Well, I think the concept that most people would, or that many would refer to in response to your question, is the concept of wisdom, right? Because we have a belief that people become wise. So we talk about wise old people, wise older women.
Commonly known as crones, yes.
To be distinguished from the disease.
Right.
And we seldom talk about the wise teenager, or the even less likely to refer to the wise child. But as people have begun to unpack the concept of wisdom and realize that wisdom may be different from what they think of. So wisdom might, from some perspective, might be the ability to do things, procedural knowledge, how to do things, how to think about things. Another element of procedural knowledge. You would think, well, that element of wisdom is probably accumulates, because you need you'll learn to do this and you learn to do something else. Sharita learned to be a whole different had a whole different professional skill set that she took on in the latter half of our of life. But other elements of wisdom, like the ability to respond to novel stimuli, in the sense of being open to experience. Why, it turns out that that kind of wisdom is evident in neonates.
Right.
So I'm not sure what, it's possible that we might evolve a concept that accurately describes the advances in thinking that emerge as a result of age, but I don't think we have it yet. And in fact, the evidence seems to be that this concept, if wisdom is the useful metaphor here that has enduring capabilities, then we'll discover that in some ways there are these things that are better when you're older, but in some ways these things might be evident at these elements of wisdom might be evident at a much younger age.
Is it possible that you just have more of it because you've accumulated more data points as you've aged? Like, that's what I wonder. It doesn't have to be the exclusive province of the old, but it could be something that you have just accumulated more of.
So that will be procedural knowledge, I think. right? But if you talk about,
But what about the kind of metacognition you were talking about before, right? The sort of awareness of the functioning of one's own mind.
yeah, so that might, if we were to evolve, that's the question we were trying to get at. Is there a new form of cognition that emerges as a result of age? And would we call it metacognition? That's a good question to ask. And so then we would need to say, well, what do we mean by metacognition? And let's study it. And I'm not aware of that kind of study actually happening at this point. And so if you were to ask, the closest I can get, if you were to ask, is there an improved form of cognition that is available only to the old, I would have to say the answer seems to be at this point yes and no.
It depends. That's the academic way of putting it. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what I wonder, though, is what if the reason we do not have a clear answer to that question is precisely what I alluded to before, that when you take your elders and you cut them off and essentially marginalize them from the larger body of society, that I think we know from prison that folks do not flourish in solitary confinement, that humans are a social species, they do best in social networks. What if we took a couple generations of our elders, reintegrated them more fully into society, really tapped the funds of knowledge there, had truly multi-generational living? Might we see a clearer emergence of exactly this kind of age-based, let's say, wisdom? We'll use that shorthand for now. That it's basically being obscured currently by the societal arrangements that we, are currently living with.
Possibly, but possibly too, people, if you would have heard these older people into the brave new world of social engagement, they might want to escape and get back.
I think that, again, there isn't just one answer. There isn't just one way of looking at it. David mentioned previously, and it was some research, I believe, that he did, in that even with neonates, you see the beginnings of perhaps what we would call personality, in that some neonates will go towards a stimulus, and some neonates will go away from a stimulus. And I believe, David, that tends to continue.
It seems as if it does.
Yeah. So you have to put in something like, your personality. And then on top of that, you have to put in culture. For many, for cultures, for instance, like the Japanese culture, older people are revered. What they say is listened to. In our North American culture, older people are not revered, except perhaps by their families, etc. But most of the attention is towards people who are younger, not people who are older. So then if you bring in again, personality, some older people will continue to look for stimulation and some won't. Some find it too much. It's overwhelming. But some people do. And I think that's a personality trait. Am I right, David? David is obviously a psychologist who knows more about it than I do.
Yeah. And it's worthwhile too to maybe to think about concepts like entropy, for example, because I'm assuming that the three of us have still retain what neurologists and neuropsychologists refer to as hemispheric asymmetry. That is to say that we have different functions in the, say, on the left and the right side of the brain. And what people are finding is that injury to one part of the brain in a previously affected, well-functioning organism is able to show plasticity. So that neuroplasticity that we referred to earlier in our conversation. Entropy, on the other hand, is an inexorable process of, let's not call it decline, let's call it devolution. Some people think we evolve into another state of being altogether. So in that instance, it's the socio-educational, if you will, environment that compensates for it. Right? And then so the mechanism for this neuroplasticity are things like the flow of blood and the perfusion of oxygenation of the brain. So if you have an injury to it, arising either from something like a stroke or a concussion playing hockey or something or other, then that neuroplasticity that arises from the perfusion of the oxygenation of the blood that allows the neuroplasticity to occur is compromised. And we have an injured brain that is unable to exercise that function of neuroplasticity that the healthy brain is able to exercise.
I wonder. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but this I feel like this brings me back to the point I was pushing earlier, because barring the kind of traumatic, accidents or like a stroke or something, episodes like that, if our blood-hungry brains are getting a gradually lessening supply as we age, I feel like isn't part of that related to kind of social pressures to shut down your movement as you age? And I'm not trying to ignore very real physical limitations that start to appear as you age, but David, I keep thinking about you playing hockey and how everybody who finds out about this is like, oh wow, that's so crazy. You're out there on the rink, and I'm thinking, why are we reacting that way? Why do we feel this is so extraordinary? That should actually be like, yeah, that man loves hockey. It's like great that he learned it later in life and is still playing, right?
Well, Jeanette, those people that say you're crazy to play hockey when you're 78 years old, they may be right.
But your brain is not suffering from lack of movement, right? I mean, that's whereas the people, and I think we've all seen them, like the folks who after a certain age kind of just shut down their bodies and they do not really move anymore. That's got to have effects on the ability of their
people shut their, like, as I watch younger people become older in the sports context. So someone will will injure themselves and will have pain, and as a result, a younger person, and could be an older person as well, but mostly it's younger people, say people in their later middle age, who have pain as a result of an injury, and they reduce their activity because they don't want to have pain. because they think that if they do things and it hurts, then they're not doing themselves a favor. Whereas for me, and I think for lots of those people that I know who are around my age and a similar kind of circumstance, will say to them, well, when you get old enough, pain is there all the time. And so you're not going to hurt yourself. In fact, the reverse is true, that, you hurt yourself by not doing things. So I guess some older people, not very many, because of the, let's say, I don't want to generalize too much beyond general based on my modest experience. But let's say I play hockey with 50 people. 2 of them, me and another guy, are older than 75. There just aren't that many people doing it. And so you have a point about encouraging people to optimize the capabilities that they have as they age, both their physical capabilities and their cognitive capabilities. I think it's worthwhile to encourage that. But at the same time, I think we don't want to impose upon older people an image of older people that extends beyond their capabilities. It's
although that would just put them kind of in the same category as everybody who's had to confront like an airbrushed photo of, their ideal, gender
of
type
themselves.
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So it becomes, another form of suppression, or a strange form of ageism, where we insist that older people become super aged.
Yes, older people should be allowed to be old. I agree, whatever that means. And what we're talking about is, let's open that range up, right? So that being old can mean
it's always younger people constantly trying to open my range up.
Yeah.
Well, this kind of naturally leads me to, I think a related topic. I talked about how, I thought that you could think about mind also extending to tools. And the classic example of this is what allows you to drive a car, is that your proprioception sort of extends, your felt sense of your surroundings extends to the body of the car. And so that's how you're able to fit into a tight parking space, or do all the kinds of crazy things I'm sure you did while you were racing cars, David. But I can't help but wonder how technology, because we can argue that we're already sort of cyborg cells, all of us who are glued to a phone or a computer or whatever, what role that could play in augmenting or supporting the unique cognitive possibilities of older age. And can that be a factor in opening up that frontier? Or, to go back to the stereotypes, is technology kind of a no-go zone as you age? And I'm not going to make I could reference all the jokes about, getting your grandson to fix your computer and whatnot, but you were saying, David?
Oh, so I was going to say, so it makes me think of like that 4-phase structure for thinking about this. So, in which there's, prevention, like what can we do to prevent ourselves from becoming less cognitively able? So, and that, that's one. And then another is, if we do suffer declines, how do we rehabilitate? So prevention, rehabilitation, and then augmentation. Like, how do we augment a capability? Then substitution. So how do we? So I was working at one point on a project where we were trying to. This is, I think, an instance of substitution. We were trying to. So, people would. Older people sometimes stay home because they know that if they went outside, went to do something, they might forget what it was that they were doing. Right? Sometimes it happens to me. I go into the basement to do something, and I can't remember what the heck it was I was doing. So, but if you're out and about, so people would stay, would isolate themselves because they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to, they would essentially get lost or forget why they were going where they were going. So in response to this, a young engineer was developing the idea of a GPS enabled memory enhancing cell phone. So this GPS memory enhancing cell phone had essentially an app that would you could press the button if you became disoriented and forgot where you were going or why you were there. You could press a button and it would give a list of the things that you usually did when you were wherever it was that you were. So if you were at the corner of Bathurst and Bloor and you forgot where you're supposed to go, you could press the button and it would say, well, usually when you're at the corner of Bathurst and Bloor, you're going here, there, or a Jeep. So that's a substitution using
Yes.
technology for a cognitive decline.
That sounds like the kind of
associated
life hack that Doris would have probably loved, right? In her interviews with Ethel, that would have been very useful. Sharita, I want to turn to you for a minute because I know you've done a lot of thinking about online and online communities, and where David gave us these wonderful categories and the example of a kind of just a supportive piece of tech. I can't help but think about, for instance, the disabled community who has found virtual environments really life-changing in terms of allowing them access and kind of extending possibilities. And I'm wondering if you can imagine something similar happening with aging, or if you see obstacles to that. I mean, I would just love to hear your take on that.
Again, I think it would go back to how much the individual enjoys challenge, enjoys learning new things. Sometimes the stereotype of, at this point, an older person, needing their grandchildren or whatever to, fix their computer or, fix their TV or something like that is true. Sometimes it's something that we convince ourselves that we can't do. And sometimes it basically just happens. The interesting thing that I've observed in terms of disability is that if you're motivated enough to try and figure out a better way or an easier way for you to do something, if you're motivated, let's say like Dorothy, to not go into the old age home, you will embrace some kind of substitution or some kind of assist. So a lot of it, I think, is motivation. I tend to be quite comfortable, with technology, possibly even more comfortable than David at times. But that's because I put myself in a situation where I always have to learn something about it. I know some people who are elderly who really embrace this, and I know some people who talk themselves out of it. So again, you're going back to what the person is comfortable with, what motivates them, um, whether that motivation is really strong. One of the principles, and you were talking earlier about education, one of the principles of adult education is that the person wants to learn. The person is motivated in a specific thing to learn something. And that's basically adult education. Otherwise, they'll just ignore it. I mean, why do I have to do something if I don't really have to do it? Um, so so I would say it's more that in terms of online communities and learning new things. One of the things that I observed when I studied online communities is the more important it is for you. Let's say if you are part of a cancer support group, the more important it is for you to communicate online with other people who have cancer because you need to learn something about yourself. Age doesn't appear to be too much of a problem. People get online. So I really think it has to do with motivation, wanting to learn something, in terms of people who are older benefiting from an online environment.
We
Yeah.
did.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, we and this following up on those comments we did. I remember with regard to people's understanding, perceptions of older people's willingness to adopt technologies. It makes me think of the we have in Ontario something called Telehealth Ontario. It used to be called the North Network, and the very first continuing education event for health professionals on what was then called North Network and is now Telehealth Ontario, I organized, and it was on distance medical consultation with older people, and the we had linked together half a dozen people from across the country, actually, talking about their experiences about this, with this, and their expectations about how older people will adapt to it. And the assumption was on the part of most people that older people wouldn't like their online doctor. But it turned out that what we discovered was that, well, and I shouldn't overgeneralize, but more often than we expected, people actually really did like their television doctor. And so it was the assumptions of younger people about the appreciations of older people that was the problem, rather than older people themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it actually sort of leads me to my final question, because as we come close to wrapping up here, I can't help but take the observation that both of you have spent time over your lifespan considering this issue of age, working with it, and now you're living it. And what I find so fascinating is it's one thing to consider a concept abstractly, intellectually as an area of study. It's another to experience it firsthand. So my question to both of you is, do you feel that you are doing age in the way that you thought you would? How much of a divergence are you experiencing between what your life is now and what you thought it might be as you were engaged professionally with these topics, and maybe let your thoughts wander to, oh, what's it going to be like when I hit 70? Or is it the experience you imagined, or is it something very different?
I didn't think about it.
Neither did I. Most of the
Fascinating.
most of the time, even now, um, I hit up against my limitations a lot because I think in my mind, I'm probably still 30 years old. I see, I mean, there are even times when I think to myself, ah, maybe I could get a master's degree or a PhD in that. Now, that's a little breathtaking, but I
It's
see it
interesting.
as a possibility, you
I
know.
injured myself playing hockey recently, and came back too soon, and ended up having to take more time off. And my commissioner of hockey said, "David, you have to let your physical body uh, take precedence over your 20-year-old mind." And he's absolutely right. But at the same time, Jeanette, perhaps more somberly, recently a dear old friend of mine died, and at a very advanced age. And in our conversations, as his death approached, even though both of us worked clinically with frail older people, um, came to the conclusion that our appreciation of the struggles of frail older people, as we helped them, was different from our appreciation of frailty as we experienced it. And so it was almost like a different world,
Mhm.
us caring for those folks and those folks actually having the experience.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, when we did the work that we did do with frail older people, for the most part, almost inexorably, they valued it, and and uh, and we were able to give people who might otherwise have removed themselves from life, gave them, sometimes decades of new life.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I don't think we really understood while we were doing that what their experience of this new life was
Mhm.
all about. And Shrita and I are entering into a phase where we're going to figure it all out for ourselves.
Yeah.
But fortunately, and for those listening, you might have twigged into the fact that Shrita and I'm Shrita's husband, and that we've lived together for decades and decades and decades. Um, um, that that uh, we our frailties, if such as they um, are sufficient, are insufficient to really remove us from life at this point. Our cognitive abilities, to get back to the origins of our conversation today, are still remain pretty strong, and we don't have that those complications that, well, for us being in our 70s, it would be like something like 22% of our peers have, with declining cognition, typically resulting from neurological changes in that 2% of our body mass that uses 20% of our body's energy resources, our brains, right there. Um, what do you think about that, Sharita?
Um, yeah, I would agree. The other thing that I think David and I both do, and both believe in, is that if you don't use it, you lose it. So both of us are physically active, and both of us are mentally active. Um, and and I think that's really important. It in many ways it gives you the edge, um, and that's why my friend Molly and I are both basically practicing with each other the mocha, because we don't intend to go into the old age home before we're ready. So that's what we do. We quiz each other. What day is it? Who is the prime minister? Can you draw a clock? Uh, so, yeah.
I'm dreading the day that somebody says that they would like to do the mocha on me, and I'm going to tell them, I can't be asked to do the mocha. I helped to develop the friggin' thing.
It's like insider trading.
Yes, we, don't touch us. We're okay. I think David and I are very lucky. I think we're privileged. If we were in other circumstances where we didn't have the privilege of education, money, good careers, the ability,
Genetics.
David? Genetics. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great sentiment to conclude on. And it kind of comes back to this idea of, how much of the experience of age is determined by our relationships, our environment. Class is obviously a huge factor, but just, I think the conditions of our everyday lives have to be huge drivers in how we experience age. And I can't tell you how grateful I am that you two were here today and were able to, instead of talking about age as an object of study, to give us the voice, the actual voice of people who are living it, and be kind of living examples of everything that is possible as you age. So on that note, I am going to wrap up today's episode. And again, thank my two wonderful guests, Sharita and David, for joining us and sharing their humor and their wisdom with us. And we will be continuing with this series. There will be forthcoming another episode, because there's no shortage of things to say about age and the process of aging. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.